The room fell silent as the janitor sat down at the grand piano. 1,000 eyes burned into his back, eyes filled with mockery, disbelief, and barely concealed contempt. The man in the worn gray uniform didn't belong here, not among the crystal chandeliers and designer gowns, not in front of the $100,000 Steinway that gleamed under the spotlight. "This is a joke, right?" Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Laughter rippled through the crowd like a wave. The kind of laughter that cuts deep, the kind that tells you exactly what people think you're worth. Isaiah Bennett's weathered hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. 52 years of scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans hadn't prepared him for this moment. 30 years had passed since his fingers last danced across ivory keys with purpose and passion. 30 years of silence. 30 years of a dream buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. But tonight that dream clawed its way back to the surface. The wealthiest man in the room, Garrett Ashford, stood near the front, his arms crossed over his $1,000 suit, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The same man who'd humiliated Isaiah just an hour ago. The same man who'd treated him like he was invisible, less than human, unworthy of basic dignity. Now Isaiah was about to do something impossible. The question hanging in the air wasn't whether he could play. The question was, how did we get here? How does a janitor end up at the center of Boston's most exclusive charity gala, sitting at a piano that professional musicians fly across the world to perform on, to understand that we need to go back? Back to the beginning of this impossible evening, back to when Isaiah Bennett was exactly where everyone expected him to be, in the shadows, unseen, unheard, and utterly forgotten. December 17th. The coldest night Boston had seen all winter. Outside the Davidson Concert Hall, snow fell in thick, heavy flakes blanketing Boylston Street in white. Inside, warmth and wealth created their own kind of insulation from the harsh world beyond those gilded doors. The Davidson Concert Hall wasn't just any venue. Built in 1892, it had hosted legends. Rachmaninoff had played here. Horowitz had brought audiences to tears within these walls. The acoustics were so perfect that a whisper on stage could be heard in the last row of the balcony. And tonight, the hall had been transformed into something even more spectacular for the annual Winter Dreams Gala, a charity event that drew Boston's elite like moths to a very expensive flame. 600 guests filled the main hall. Diamonds caught the light from chandeliers that had witnessed over a century of performances. Tuxedos and evening gowns worth more than most people's yearly salaries moved through the space like schools of exotic fish. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume-aged wine and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having to check a price tag. A string quartet played softly in one corner, Vivaldi perfectly executed, perfectly ignored. Servers in crisp white uniforms moved through the crowd with silver trays of champagne and canapes that cost more per bite than a fast food meal. This was the world of the 1%, and everyone here knew it. They wore their wealth like armor, their status like crowns. And then there was Isaiah Bennett. He moved through this glittering world like a ghost, pushing his cleaning cart along the perimeter of the hall, stopping occasionally to empty a trash receptacle or wipe down a surface that someone's champagne glass had left a ring on. At 52, Isaiah had the kind of lean, strong build that came from decades of physical labor. His hair going gray at the temples was cut close to his head. His face bore the lines of a man who'd lived through loss and learned to carry it quietly. The gray janitor's uniform he wore was clean but faded from countless washings. A name tag, pinned slightly crooked on his chest, read Isaiah facilities. Not Mr. Bennett. Not even just Bennett. Just Isaiah. Just the first name. Just the job, just enough to identify him as part of the invisible workforce that kept places like this running. Nobody looked at him. That was the unspoken rule in places like this. The help was there, of course, someone had to be, but they existed in a parallel dimension, seen only when needed, forgotten immediately after. Isaiah had learned this lesson over 15 years of working at the Davidson. He'd become very good at being invisible. But invisibility is a strange kind of armor. It protects you, yes, but it also imprisons you. And sometimes on nights like this, when music filled the air and memories pressed close, that prison felt unbearably small. What none of these glittering guests knew, what none of them could have guessed, was that Isaiah Bennett hadn't always pushed a cleaning cart through concert halls. Once, a lifetime ago, he'd been destined for the stage itself. 30 years earlier, Isaiah had been a different person entirely. At 22, he'd been a piano performance major at Berklee College of Music, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. His teachers had called him exceptional gifted, possibly even brilliant. He'd had the kind of natural talent that couldn't be taught, an instinct for music that went deeper than technique, an ability to make a piano sing in ways that moved people to tears. He'd grown up in Roxbury, the son of a bus driver, father, and a mother who cleaned houses. They'd saved every penny to pay for his lessons, recognized his gift early, and sacrificed everything to nurture it. His father, Marcus Bennett, had worked double shifts, so Isaiah could attend the prestigious Boston Youth Symphony program. His mother, Grace, had taken on extra houses scrubbing floors, so her son could one day perform on stages instead of cleaning them. Isaiah had been their dream made flesh, their hope for a better future, proof that talent and hard work could overcome any circumstance. And then, 3 weeks before his senior recital, 3 weeks before graduation, 3 weeks before the future everyone had planned for him could begin, his father had collapsed on his bus route. Massive heart attack, gone before the ambulance arrived. 51 years old, the same age Isaiah was now. The funeral expenses came first, then the medical bills that insurance didn't cover, then the mortgage payments his mother couldn't make alone, then the reality that someone had to take care of things, had to be practical, had to set aside dreams and pick up responsibilities. Isaiah had withdrawn from Berklee 3 weeks before graduation. He'd packed up his dreams along with his belongings, moved back home, and taken the first steady job he could find. Facilities maintenance at the Davidson Concert Hall. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd gone from preparing to perform at venues like this to cleaning them instead. His mother had died 5 years later, her heart broken by grief and guilt. She'd spent her last days apologizing to Isaiah for ruining his future, though it had never been her fault, could never have been her fault. He'd married young to a woman named Claire, who'd loved him despite the sadness he carried. They'd had 3 good years together before cancer took her too. No children, no family left. Just Isaiah and the memories of everyone he'd loved and lost. For 15 years now, he'd walked these halls, pushed this cart, emptied these trash cans. For 15 years, he'd heard music performed by others in this space, each note a reminder of what he'd given up, what he'd lost, what he'd never become. The piano in his apartment had been sold years ago to pay for Claire's final medical bills. He hadn't touched a keyboard in 30 years, hadn't wanted to. The pain of it was too sharp, the loss too fresh even decades later. But the music never left him. It lived in his bones, in his blood, in the part of his soul that no amount of loss or time could erase. Some nights, lying awake in his small studio apartment, he could feel his fingers moving through pieces he'd once known by heart, playing silent concertos on invisible keys. Tonight would be different, though. Tonight, everything buried would rise to the surface. Tonight, Isaiah Bennett would remember who he used to be, who he might have been, who perhaps he still was underneath the uniform, and the years and the weight of a life lived in the margins. But first there would be humiliation. The Winter Dreams Gala was in full swing now. Speeches had been made, donations pledged, backs patted. The charity in question, something to do with arts education for underprivileged youth, though most people here couldn't remember the specifics, had raised over $2 million. The guests felt good about themselves, virtuous, philanthropic. They'd bought their indulgences for another year. Helena Briggs, the event coordinator, moved through the crowd with practiced grace. At 48, she'd been organizing events like this for 20 years, had perfected the art of managing wealthy egos and keeping everything running smoothly. She wore an elegant navy dress that cost more than Isaiah made in a month. Her blonde hair pulled back in a style that said professional without saying trying too hard. She caught Isaiah's eye as he emptied a trash can near the eastern wall and gave him a slight nod, the kind of acknowledgement that the help received when they were doing their job correctly, which is to say, invisibly. Isaiah nodded back, then returned to his work. The main event of the evening was still to come. World-renowned pianist Vladimir Petrov was scheduled to perform at 9 o'clock. The Russian virtuoso had flown in specifically for this event, commanding a fee of $50,000 for a 45-minute performance. His name alone had sold tickets, had brought in donors, had made this evening the social event of the season. The Steinway grand piano sat center stage, its black surface gleaming like still water under the lights. It had been tuned that afternoon by a specialist brought in from New York. Everything was perfect, precisely calibrated, ready for a master's touch. But before Petrov could perform, there were more speeches to endure, more champagne to drink, more networking to be done. The guests circulated, formed clusters, broke apart, and reformed in different configurations. Conversations hummed around topics of vacation homes and market portfolios of whose children got into which Ivy League schools, of the minor inconveniences of extreme wealth. Isaiah had heard it all before, year after year. These people existed in a different universe, one where money solved all problems, where the worst crisis was a delayed yacht delivery or a disappointing Michelin-starred meal. They had no concept of what it meant to choose between medicine and food, between heat and electricity, between dreams and survival. He didn't hate them exactly. Hatred required too much energy, too much caring. He simply observed them with the detachment of an anthropologist studying an alien species. They were as foreign to him as he was invisible to them. But there was one guest who would soon make himself very visible in Isaiah's life, and not in a good way. Garrett Ashford stood near the bar holding court among a circle of admirers. At 55, Ashford was everything American capitalism promised you could become if you were smart enough, ruthless enough, lucky enough. He'd built a tech empire from nothing, or so the story went, though nothing in Ashford's case had included a 7-figure trust fund and elite university connections. His company, Ashford Technologies, had gone public 5 years earlier, making him a billionaire several times over. He had the kind of face that looked good on magazine covers, strong jaw, silver hair, teeth too white to be natural. His tuxedo was bespoke, probably cost $15,000, fit him like a second skin. He wore his wealth the way other men wore cologne liberally, and with the assumption that everyone around him appreciated it. Ashford had opinions about everything and the platform to share them. He spoke loudly about meritocracy, about how anyone could succeed if they just worked hard enough, about how the problem with poor people was that they didn't try hard enough. He'd written a book about his success that had somehow become a bestseller full of advice that only made sense if you'd started with every advantage he'd had. He was also, though few would say it to his face, a complete and utter ass. It happened at 8:37. Isaiah would remember the exact time because he'd been checking his watch, counting the minutes until his shift ended at 9, until he could leave this glittering cage and return to the simple quiet of his apartment. He was carrying a tray of used champagne glasses back toward the service corridor, moving carefully through the crowd, trying not to disturb the conversations happening around him. The tray was heavy crystal glasses, always were, but he'd carried heavier, had been doing this job long enough that it was second nature. Garrett Ashford was holding forth to a group of 5 or 6 people, telling some story that required large gestures and frequent laughter at his own wit. He stepped backward suddenly, still talking, not looking moving, with the confidence of a man who'd never had to watch where he was going, because the world always made room for him. He stepped directly into Isaiah's path. The collision was inevitable. Isaiah tried to adjust, tried to move around him, but there wasn't time, wasn't space. The tray tilted, glasses slid, and then Garrett Ashford's pristine white tuxedo shirt was splashed with champagne and what remained of someone's strawberry canapé. The conversation stopped. Heads turned. A circle of attention formed around them like a spotlight. What the hell? Ashford spun around his face, flushing red, looking down at his ruined shirt with the kind of horror that suggested he'd just been shot rather than slightly dampened. Are you serious right now? Isaiah's heart sank. Sir, I apologize. I stepped back into what Ashford's voice rose, cutting through the ambient noise of the gala, drawing more attention. Into your incompetence, into your inability to do a simple job. Isaiah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. His throat tightened. Sir, if you'd just let me get something to clean. Do you have any idea how much this tuxedo costs? Ashford was in full performance mode, now playing to his audience, aware that everyone was watching. Do you have any idea who I am? I apologize, sir. It was an accident. Isaiah's voice was quiet, steady, dignified, despite the humiliation burning in his chest. An accident. Ashford laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's what people like you always say, isn't it? Never take responsibility. Always an excuse. He turned to the crowd around them as if addressing a jury. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. No work ethic, no attention to detail, and we're supposed to feel sorry for people who can't even carry a tray without destroying someone's evening. The crowd was silent, uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene. This was Garrett Ashford, after all. Nobody contradicted Garrett Ashford. His donations kept places like this running. His approval opened doors. His disapproval closed them. Isaiah stood there, still holding the now mostly empty tray, feeling something crack inside his chest. Not anger. Anger would have been cleaner, simpler. This was something worse. This was the feeling of being erased, of being reduced to less than human, of being reminded that in spaces like this he didn't matter, would never matter, was nothing more than an inconvenience at best, and a target for cruelty at worst. Well, Ashford demanded, are you going to stand there staring, or are you going to clean this up? Isaiah set the tray down carefully. His hands didn't shake. He wouldn't give Ashford that satisfaction. He pulled a cloth from his cart and knelt down, began wiping at the champagne that had splashed onto the floor, onto Ashford's shoes, onto the hem of someone's gown nearby. Kneeling, cleaning up a mess that wasn't his fault, in front of 600 people who'd just been lectured about meritocracy and hard work, and the poor not trying hard enough. "That's better," Ashford said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe you'll pay attention next time. Maybe you'll remember that when important people are present, you need to be more careful." Someone in the crowd laughed. Others looked away, suddenly fascinated by their champagne glasses or the art on the walls. Nobody spoke up. Nobody defended him. Nobody said what everyone with any decency was thinking, that Ashford was being cruel, that this was unnecessary, that a man's dignity shouldn't be stripped away for a minor accident. But they didn't, because this was how the world worked in spaces like this. Money bought not just comfort, but impunity. Wealth meant never having to apologize, never having to be wrong, never having to see the humanity in people you considered beneath you. Isaiah finished cleaning and stood up. He looked Garrett Ashford directly in the eye, the first time he'd made direct eye contact with any guest in 15 years. In that moment, something passed between them, something Ashford didn't recognize, but Isaiah felt acutely. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even anger. It was recognition. Recognition that Ashford saw him as nothing, and recognition that perhaps Ashford was wrong. "Will there be anything else?" Sir Isaiah's voice was steady, professional, giving away nothing. "Just try not to destroy anyone else's evening," Ashford said dismissively, already turning back to his audience, ready to make a joke about the incident, to turn his cruelty into entertainment. Isaiah gathered his cleaning supplies and walked toward the service corridor, his back straight, his pace measured. He would not run. He would not let them see how deep the wound went. But once he was through the door, once he was alone in the narrow hallway where the staff moved unseen, he stopped. He pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes. His hands were shaking now, not from anger, but from the effort of holding everything inside. 30 years. 30 years of being invisible, of accepting his place, of making peace with a life half-lived. 30 years of telling himself it didn't matter, that dreams were for the young, that he'd made his choice and had to live with it. But in that moment, pressed against a wall in a service corridor, while laughter and music filtered through from the world of light and wealth beyond, something inside Isaiah Bennett began to change. Isaiah didn't return to the main hall immediately. He stood in that corridor, breathing slowly, trying to calm the storm that Garrett Ashford had unleashed inside him. The walls here were plain, painted, institutional beige, nothing like the ornate grandeur of the concert hall proper. This was backstage, behind the curtain, where the machinery of elegance revealed itself to be just machinery. Service elevators, storage closets, break rooms with flickering fluorescent lights, and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. He'd spent 15 years in spaces like this, parallel to beauty, but never part of it, adjacent to art, but never touching it. He'd made his peace with it. He'd had to. What choice did he have? But peace, it turned out, was fragile. It could be shattered by a moment of casual cruelty, by a reminder that no matter how much you told yourself you'd accepted your place in the world, some part of you never stopped aching for something more. A memory surfaced unbidden and sharp. 22 years old, sitting in a practice room at Berklee at 2 a.m, playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 for the 100th time that day, trying to perfect the transition in the third section, where the melody had to soar without becoming sentimental, where the technical demands couldn't overwhelm the emotional truth of the piece. His teacher, Professor Dmitry Volkov, a retired concert pianist with hands that still moved like water, even in his 70s, had stood in the doorway listening. When Isaiah finished, Volkov had walked slowly to the piano, placed one hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "You have gift," he'd said in his thick Russian accent. not just talent. Gift. Gift is different. Gift is rare. Gift is burden and blessing both. You understand, Isaiah had nodded, though at 22, he hadn't really understood. Not yet. With gift comes responsibility. Volkov had continued. Responsibility to music, yes, but also to yourself. To honor what you have been given. To not waste it. You promise me this, I promise. Isaiah had said, believing it with the certainty of youth, unable to imagine a future where that promise couldn't be kept. Standing in the service corridor 30 years later, Isaiah felt the weight of that broken promise like a physical thing pressing on his chest. He'd had a gift. He'd wasted it. Not through choice exactly, but wasted nonetheless. The reasons didn't change the result. Another memory, his father, 3 days before he died, sitting at the kitchen table of their small Roxbury apartment, reviewing the budget for Isaiah's final semester at Berklee. Marcus Bennett had been tired. Isaiah could see that now, looking back with adult eyes, the kind of bone-deep tired that comes from working 2 jobs for 20 years. But he'd been smiling. 4 more months, Marcus had said. 4 more months and you walk across that stage. First Bennett to graduate college. First Bennett to make music instead of just listening to it. Your mama and I will be in the front row. We'll be so proud we'll probably embarrass you. You won't embarrass me, Isaiah had said, 22 and invincible. Unable to imagine his father wouldn't be there. That front row seat would remain empty. That pride would curdle into grief. We did good, Marcus had said quietly. We gave you a chance. That's all a parent can do, give their child a chance at something better. You're going to do amazing things, son. You're going to make beautiful music. You're going to touch people's lives. I know it. But he hadn't. Isaiah hadn't made beautiful music or touched anyone's lives. He'd cleaned floors. He'd emptied trash cans. He'd become exactly the kind of invisible person his parents had worked so hard to save him from becoming. The shame of it was crushing. Not shame at being a janitor. Honest work was honest work, but shame at having been given a gift and letting it die. Shame at having made promises he couldn't keep. Shame at having disappointed the dead. Isaiah pushed off from the wall. He couldn't stay in this corridor forever. His shift wasn't over. There was still work to do, trash to empty, surfaces to wipe down. That was his life now. That was his reality. But as he reached for his cleaning cart, a sound stopped him. Music. Not the string quartet that had been playing earlier. Not recorded music or casual performance. This was different. This was someone tuning the Steinway Grand on the main stage, preparing it for Vladimir Petrov's performance. The technician was running through scales, testing the response of each key, making final adjustments. Isaiah stood motionless, listening. God, he'd forgotten what a perfectly tuned piano sounded like. Each note was pure, crystalline true. The Steinway's tone was legendary, warm, but bright, powerful, but nuanced, capable of the most delicate whisper or the most thunderous fortissimo. His fingers twitched. Muscle memory 3 decades dormant, suddenly alive. His right hand formed the shape of a chord without conscious thought. His left hand's thumb and pinky stretched to span an octave. How long had it been? 30 years. 30 years since he'd felt ivory keys beneath his fingertips. 30 years since he'd made music instead of just hearing it. Could he still play? Would his hands remember what his mind had tried so hard to forget? The question terrified him. What if he'd lost it completely? What if the gift Professor Volkov had spoken of had atrophied from neglect? What if his father had been wrong, and Isaiah was never meant to do amazing things after all? But underneath the terror was something else. Something he'd thought was dead, but was apparently only sleeping. Hunger. Not for food or comfort or even recognition. Hunger to touch a piano again. Hunger to feel that connection between thought and sound. Hunger to remember even for a moment who he used to be. The tuning session ended. Silence fell. The technician's footsteps receded toward the backstage area, and Isaiah Bennett, janitor, invisible man keeper of broken promises, made a decision that would change everything. Isaiah returned to the main hall, but something had shifted. He moved through the crowd with his cleaning cart, performing his duties, but his attention was elsewhere. His eyes kept drifting to the stage, to the Steinway grand piano that sat waiting under the lights. It had been 10 minutes since the humiliation with Garrett Ashford. The incident was already forgotten by everyone except Isaiah. The crowd had moved on to other conversations, other dramas. That was how it worked. His pain was momentary entertainment, nothing more. Helena Briggs was near the stage, speaking with a young man holding a clipboard, her assistant probably. She looked tense, kept checking her watch. Isaiah had worked enough of these events to read the signs. Something was wrong. He emptied a trash can near enough to overhear. "Can't reach him," the assistant was saying. "His phone goes straight to voicemail. The hotel says he never checked in. That's impossible." Helena's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Vladimir Petrov doesn't just not show up. He's a professional. I know, but keep trying. Call his management company again. Call the airline. Call someone." Helena pressed her fingers to her temples. "He's due on stage in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Isaiah moved away, his heart sinking. Vladimir Petrov wasn't coming. The evening's main event, the performance that everyone had paid premium ticket prices to witness, wasn't going to happen. Part of him, a very small, very petty part, felt a flash of satisfaction. Let Garrett Ashford's evening be ruined. Let these people who'd watched him be humiliated face a disappointment of their own. But mostly, he just felt sad. Sad that 600 people wouldn't get to hear great music performed. Sad that the Steinway Grand would sit silent. Sad that another evening would pass with the piano untouched, with music unmade, with a gift unused. The announcement came 15 minutes later. Helena Briggs walked onto the stage, her professional smile looking slightly strained. The crowd quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I have disappointing news." Her voice projected beautifully. She was good at this, at managing disasters with grace. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Maestro Petrov has been delayed and will be unable to perform this evening. A murmur ran through the crowd. Disappointment, annoyance, the particular frustration of wealthy people who'd paid for something and weren't receiving it. However, Helena continued, "We hope you'll continue to enjoy the gala. The string quartet will play an extended set, and we'll be arranging a future performance. This is unacceptable. Garrett." Ashford's voice cut through the space like a knife. He strode toward the stage, every inch the aggrieved customer. People paid significant money for tickets tonight. They came here for a world-class performance. Are you telling me there's not a single qualified pianist in all of Boston who can fill in? Helena's smile remained fixed, but Isaiah could see the tension in her shoulders. "Mr. Ashford, I understand your frustration, but a pianist of Maestro Petrov's caliber isn't easy to replace on zero notice. I don't want to hear excuses." Ashford turned to address the crowd, playing to the audience again. "This is exactly what's wrong with arts organizations today. Poor planning, no backup options, expecting people to just accept mediocrity." The crowd murmured in agreement. They were with Ashford now, united in their disappointment, looking for someone to blame. Isaiah watched from his position near the wall. He watched Helena Briggs try to maintain her composure while being publicly criticized. He watched the entitled anger of people who'd been denied their entertainment. He watched the beautiful piano sitting silent on the stage. And something inside him snapped. not with anger, not even with indignation, but with a sudden crystal-clear certainty that had been building all evening. He'd spent 30 years being invisible, 30 years accepting his place, 30 years letting fear and circumstances and the weight of loss keep him small and silent. 30 years was long enough. His hands were shaking as he parked his cleaning cart against the wall. His heart hammered in his chest. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was insane, that he would only humiliate himself further, that some things once lost could never be reclaimed. But underneath the fear was something stronger. A voice that sounded like his father. "You're going to do amazing things, son." A voice that sounded like Professor Volkov. "With gift comes responsibility." A voice that sounded like his younger self, the 22-year-old who'd believed anything was possible. "I promise." Isaiah Bennett took a deep breath, stepped away from the shadows, and began walking toward the stage. The argument was escalating. Garrett Ashford wasn't backing down, and Helena Briggs was clearly fighting to maintain control of a situation spiraling rapidly toward disaster. "Perhaps we could offer refunds," Helena was saying. "I don't want a refund," Ashford interrupted. "I want what I paid for. I want music. I want this evening to be what it was supposed to be." He gestured at the piano. "There's a $100,000 instrument sitting there unused. Surely someone in this city can play it. On this short notice with a program as complex as what Maestro Petrov was going to perform. Then play something simpler. Play anything, or admit that this entire event is a fraud and let people leave." Other voices joined in now, emboldened by Ashford's anger. Complaints about ticket prices, about expectations not being met, about the general decline in professional standards. The mob mentality that wealthy people rarely think they're capable of exhibiting, but absolutely are. Helena looked genuinely distressed now. This event was her reputation, her career. A failure here would follow her. The arts community in Boston was small, and memories were long. Isaiah was halfway across the floor, now weaving between guests who paid him no attention. Invisible, still even now. He could turn back. He could return to his cart, finish his shift. Go home, forget this moment of temporary insanity. But his feet kept moving forward. Near the stage, he saw someone else he recognized, Julian Cross, a conductor Isaiah had read about in the Boston Globe. Cross was in his 60s, led the Boston Philharmonic, had a reputation for discovering new talent. He was speaking quietly with his companion, an elegantly dressed woman who'd been watching the confrontation with distaste. "Vulgar," the woman was saying. "Absolutely vulgar." "Agreed," Cross replied. "But he's not wrong that it's disappointing. I was looking forward to Petrov's interpretation of the Chopin ballade. I've heard recordings, but live." He sighed. "Ah well, such is life." Chopin's Ballade No. 1. The piece Isaiah had been perfecting 30 years ago. The piece he'd played in that practice room at 2 a.m. The piece that Professor Volkov had said proved Isaiah had a gift. The piece he could still play in his sleep, even after 3 decades. Isaiah reached the edge of the stage area. A few people glanced at him, confused about why the janitor was there, but quickly looked away. Helena Briggs and Garrett Ashford were still arguing, their voices rising. "If you cannot provide what was promised," Ashford was saying, "then this entire evening is a failure, and I'll make sure everyone knows." "Excuse me." Isaiah's voice was quiet, but something in its tone cut through the argument. Both Helena and Ashford turned to stare at him. Helena's expression was confused. Ashford's was outraged that the help had dared to interrupt. "What do you want?" Ashford demanded. "Haven't you done enough damage for one evening?" Isaiah ignored him, kept his eyes on Helena Briggs. Ma'am, I can play. Silence. A bubble of stunned silence that expanded outward as people realized what he'd just said. Helena blinked. I'm sorry, what the piano? I can play it, if you need someone to perform. Isaiah's voice was steadier than he felt. I can play the Chopin ballade. I can play the program Maestro Petrov was scheduled for. I know the pieces. Ashford laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Oh, this is priceless. First you ruin my evening with your incompetence, and now you're claiming you can replace Vladimir Petrov. This is what passes for reality in your world. Helena looked torn between hope and horror. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but what? You can't be seriously considering this. Ashford turned to the crowd. She's actually considering letting the janitor play. More laughter rippled through the guests. The idea was absurd, ridiculous. A janitor claiming he could perform at a level that professional concert pianists spent lifetimes trying to achieve. It was either a joke or delusion. Isaiah felt every eye on him, felt the weight of their disbelief, their mockery, their absolute certainty that he was nothing could be. Nothing would always be nothing. But he also felt his fingers remembering chord progressions, felt muscle memory stirring after 3 decades of sleep, felt something in his chest that might have been terror or might have been hope. I studied at Berklee, he said quietly, still looking only at Helena. Piano performance. I didn't graduate, but I can play. I promise you I can play. Helena's expression shifted curiosity, replacing dismissal. Berklee. When? 30 years ago. I was in my final semester when I had to withdraw. Each word cost him something, revealing a past he'd buried. But I remember. I remember all of it, 30 years ago. Ashford seized on this. You haven't played in 30 years, and you think you can just walk up there and perform, lady. Either this man is lying or he's delusional. Either way, don't waste everyone's time. Julian Cross had moved closer, was listening with interest now. What pieces, he asked Isaiah. What would you play? Isaiah turned to face the conductor. This man whose opinion actually mattered in the world of music. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, then the Beethoven Sonata Pathétique second movement. I could also play Debussy's Clair de Lune, or several Rachmaninoff preludes, or... He stopped, aware he was rambling. Cross's eyebrows had risen. That's quite a repertoire to claim. I'm not claiming. I can play them. Isaiah's voice was firm, despite his shaking hands. I understand it sounds impossible. I understand you have no reason to believe me. But if you give me 10 minutes at that piano, I can prove it. This is insane, Ashford said, but some of the certainty had drained from his voice. Something about Isaiah's quiet conviction was giving even him pause. Helena looked at Julian Cross, a silent question passing between them. Cross shrugged slightly, the gesture saying, Why not? What do we have to lose? All right, Helena said slowly. You have 5 minutes to warm up. If you can genuinely play, not just bang on keys, we'll consider it. But if this is some kind of joke, it's not a joke. Isaiah's heart was racing so fast he thought he might pass out. What had he just done? What was he doing? But it was too late to back out now. The crowd was watching, waiting to see if the impossible claim would become impossible humiliation. Garrett Ashford wore an expression of eager anticipation, ready to witness Isaiah fail to see him put back in his place. Isaiah walked toward the stage steps, his legs feeling disconnected from his body. The stage lights were bright, disorienting. The Steinway grand piano seemed impossibly large, impossibly intimidating. He was 52 years old. He was a janitor. He hadn't touched a piano in 30 years. He was about to find out if a gift once given could ever truly be lost. The walk from the floor to the piano bench felt like miles. Isaiah was aware of every eye on him, aware of the weight of expectation and disbelief pressing down from all sides. The stage lights were hot, bright, exposing. There was nowhere to hide here, no shadows to slip into, no anonymity to protect him. This was the opposite of invisibility. This was being seen by everyone all at once. His gray janitor's uniform suddenly felt unbearably shabby under these lights, surrounded by this elegance. A voice in his head. It sounded like Garrett Ashford whispered that he didn't belong here, that this was a mistake, that some people were meant to be on stages and others were meant to clean them, and Isaiah had learned which category he belonged to a long time ago. But another voice, his father's voice, whispered back, "You're going to do amazing things, son." The piano bench was exactly where it should be, the right distance from the keys. Some things were standard universal. Isaiah sat down, and the simple act of assuming this position unlocked a flood of memories so intense they almost overwhelmed him. The practice rooms at Berklee, the cheap upright piano in his childhood apartment where he'd first learned to play, the concert hall where he'd performed as a finalist in the Boston Youth Symphony competition at 16, the moment when he'd absolutely known, that music was his destiny. His hands hovered over the keys, and he realized they were shaking. Not just trembling, but actually shaking palsy-like, uncontrolled. 30 years. 30 years since these hands had done this. Would they remember? Could they remember? The piano keys were smooth and cool under his fingertips. Ivory, real ivory, on an instrument this old and valuable. They felt foreign and familiar all at once, like greeting an old friend you'd lost touch with and weren't sure still knew your name. Isaiah closed his eyes, took a breath. In his mind, he could hear Professor Volkov's voice from 3 decades ago. "Before you play, you must breathe. You must center. Music does not come from fingers. Music comes from here." And the old Russian would tap his chest right over his heart. From here. The crowd was silent now, waiting. How long had he been sitting there? 30 seconds, a minute. It felt like an eternity. Play something, his mind urged. Just play something. Prove you're not crazy. Prove you can do this. But which piece he'd claimed he could play so many? The Chopin Ballade was what Petrov had been scheduled to perform, but it was also nearly 10 minutes long, incredibly complex, technically demanding. If he was going to fail, it would be a spectacular failure. Or he could play something simpler. Clair de Lune was beautiful, but less technically challenging. He could probably get through it even if his fingers were rusty, even if his technique had deteriorated. But playing it safe meant admitting he wasn't really good enough. Meant confirming what everyone already believed, that a janitor couldn't possibly perform at a professional level. In the front row, he could see Julian Cross watching intently. The conductor's expression was neutral, withholding judgment, but clearly skeptical. Next to him, Helena Briggs looked nervous, probably regretting her decision to allow this. And there was Garrett Ashford, arms crossed, wearing a smirk that said he couldn't wait to witness this disaster, to see Isaiah humiliated even more thoroughly than before. Something hardened in Isaiah's chest. He'd been humiliated enough for one lifetime. He'd been invisible for 30 years. He'd let fear and loss and the weight of responsibility crush his dreams into dust. But he'd also been gifted. Professor Volkov had said so. His father had believed it. His mother had sacrificed for it. And deep down, underneath all the years and pain and resignation, Isaiah had never stopped believing it either. He would play the Chopin Ballade. All of it. Every note. The way it was meant to be played, the way he'd learned to play it 3 decades ago in a practice room at Berklee while preparing for a senior recital that never happened. He would play it for his father, who'd died believing his son would do amazing things. He would play it for his mother, who'd apologized with her dying breath for a sacrifice she should never have had to make. He would play it for his wife Claire, who'd loved him even when he'd forgotten how to love himself. He would play it for Professor Volkov and the promise he'd made and broken. And he would play it for himself, for the 22-year-old who'd had dreams, and for the 52-year-old who'd forgotten he was allowed to have them. Isaiah opened his eyes, positioned his hands over the keys. The opening of Chopin's Ballade. Number 1 began with a single note, a D, played quietly, mysteriously, like a question being asked. He pressed the key. The note rang out pure and clear into the silence. And just like that, after 30 years, Isaiah Bennett was playing piano again. The opening of Chopin's Ballade Number 1 is deceptive. It begins quietly, almost tentatively, a single melodic line that could be mistaken for something simple. But within those first few measures lies a complexity that reveals itself gradually, like depth under still water. Isaiah's right hand carried the melody, while his left hand provided gentle support. The first 8 measures were like a question haunting, uncertain searching for something just out of reach. His fingers remembered. Dear God, they remembered. Despite 3 decades of emptying trash and pushing mops, despite arthritis beginning to set in, and hands that weren't as supple as they'd once been, muscle memory proved stronger than time. The patterns were still there, encoded in nerves and tendons waiting to be awakened. But it wasn't just memory, it was instinct. The same instinct that Professor Volkov had called a gift, the thing that separated technical proficiency from genuine artistry. Isaiah could feel the music, could sense where each phrase needed to breathe, where the dynamics needed to swell or fade, where the tempo needed to push forward or pull back. The crowd was silent. Not the restless silence of boredom or the expectant silence of curiosity, but the profound silence of people realizing they were hearing something they hadn't expected, something real. The ballade's opening section built gradually. Chopin had been a master of building tension through melody, of creating a sense of forward motion that felt both inevitable and surprising. Isaiah let the music unfold, trusting his hands, trusting the instincts that had never really left him. Garrett Ashford's smirk had faded. He was still standing in the same position, arms crossed, but his expression had shifted to something harder to read. Confusion, maybe, or the first hint of doubt. Helena Briggs had both hands pressed to her mouth. Even from the piano bench, Isaiah could see the surprise in her eyes. And Julian Cross, the conductor's entire demeanor, had changed. He'd leaned forward, his full attention locked on Isaiah's hands, on the way they moved across the keys with increasing confidence. Cross knew music the way sailors know the sea. He could hear the difference between someone who'd memorized notes and someone who understood them. The first section of the ballade lasted about 90 seconds before transitioning into something more complex. Here was where the piece really began to make its technical demands. The tempo increased. The left hand needed to execute rapid arpeggios, while the right hand carried a melodic line that required precise fingering and perfect timing. Isaiah had struggled with this section, even when he'd practiced it daily at Berklee. The transition was treacherous, easy to fumble, easy to let the technical requirements overwhelm the musical meaning. But his hands knew the path. They'd traveled it hundreds of times in another life. And somehow, they found their way back. The arpeggio flowed like water from his left hand. His right hand sang the melody with a clarity that surprised even him. He was playing. He was actually playing, not just hitting the right notes, but making music, real music, the kind that reached past the ears, straight to something deeper. The 5-minute warm-up Helena had promised was forgotten. Nobody was counting. Nobody was watching the clock. The crowd had collectively held its breath, uncertain what they were witnessing, but unable to look away. Isaiah felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years, joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The joy of doing the thing you were meant to do, the thing your body and soul were designed for. The joy of coming home after a long exile. His eyes were closed now, seeing the music, instead of the keys, feeling each note as it resonated through the Steinway's body and out into the hall. The Davidsons' acoustics were everything their reputation promised. Every note was clear, perfectly balanced, filling the space without overwhelming it. The first major section of the ballade concluded with a descending figure that needed to trail off like a question being answered with another question. Isaiah's fingers executed it perfectly, the notes fading into silence. He paused. Not for effect, the music demanded the pause. Chopin had written it as a moment of reflection before the piece shifted into its next phase. In that silence, Isaiah heard someone whisper, "My God." He opened his eyes. The crowd was completely still. Even Garrett Ashford stood frozen, his certainty visibly shaken. Isaiah looked at Julian Cross. The conductor gave a slight nod, so small it was almost imperceptible. But it was enough. It was permission. It was recognition. It was one musician acknowledging another. Isaiah turned back to the piano. The warm-up was over. The question had been answered. He could play. That much was proven, but the ballade was far from finished. The opening section was just the invitation. What came next was the real journey, the part where Chopin took the listener through every human emotion, where the piece built to devastating climaxes and moments of heartbreaking tenderness. Isaiah had claimed he could play the entire piece. Now, he would have to prove it. He took a breath, positioned his hands again, and dove into the heart of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, knowing there was no turning back now, knowing that the next 8 minutes would either confirm the gift Professor Volkov had spoken of, or reveal it as a delusion he'd carried for 3 decades. His hands moved to the keys, and the story continued. The second section of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 begins with a shift in character from questioning to assertive, from shadow to light. It's marked meno mosso, meaning slightly slower, and it introduces a new melody that feels almost pastoral, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Isaiah's hands navigated this transition with growing confidence. The initial shakiness was gone now, burned away by the act of playing itself. 30 years hadn't erased his training or his instinct. They'd only buried them. And now that they were unearthed, they felt as natural as breathing. The technical demands were significant. The right hand carried a singing melody that required careful voicing, making certain notes ring out, while others provided harmonic support. The left hand needed to provide rhythmic stability, while also adding counter-melodies that wove in and out of the primary theme. But what made this section powerful wasn't just the technical execution. It was the emotion. Chopin had poured longing into these measures, a bittersweet ache for something beautiful that couldn't last. Isaiah understood that longing intimately. He'd lived it for 30 years. In the audience, people had stopped pretending to be casual observers. They were listening now, really listening with the kind of attention that great music demands and deserves. Conversations had ceased. Phones had been pocketed. Even the servers along the walls had stopped moving, held in place by sound. Julian Cross had pulled out a program and was following along, checking whether Isaiah was truly performing the piece as written or improvising something that merely sounded like Chopin. His eyebrows rose slightly. Isaiah was playing it exactly right, every note where it belonged, every dynamic marking, honored every phrasing choice, defensible. Helena Briggs had tears in her eyes. She'd organized this event, had worked for months to make it perfect, and it had nearly been destroyed by Petrov's absence. Now this impossible thing was happening. A janitor was saving her gala with a performance that was against all logic and probability, actually good. Better than good. Extraordinary. Garrett Ashford was no longer smiling. His arms had uncrossed. He stood rigid, his face unreadable, watching Isaiah's hands move across the keys with something that might have been respect, or might have been fury. It was hard to tell. The pastoral section built toward its climax. Chopin had crafted a moment of pure triumph here, where the melody soared upward in octaves, the harmony shifted to major, and for a brief instant everything felt possible and perfect. Isaiah let himself feel it, the triumph, the joy, the sense of rightness. His hands stretched across the keyboard, executing the octave leaps with precision. The Steinway responded beautifully, its tone rich and full, capable of the power the music demanded without ever becoming harsh. But then, as Chopin always did, the brightness faded. The major harmony dissolved back into minor. The melody, fragmented, became uncertain again. The piece had more to say, darker things, more complex truths. The third section accelerated. The tempo marking read presto con fuoco, fast, with fire. This was where many pianists failed, where the technical demands became so severe that accuracy and musicality couldn't coexist. The left hand needed to execute rapid, repeated notes, while the right hand played fast runs that covered the entire keyboard. It was virtuosic, showy, designed to demonstrate mastery. Isaiah felt a flicker of doubt. This section had challenged him even at 22, when he'd practiced 8 hours a day, when his hands were young and fearless. Could he still do it at 52 with hands that had spent 3 decades doing anything but playing piano? But he'd come this far. He'd opened the door to his past. There was no closing it now. He launched into the presto section, his fingers moving faster than thought, operating on pure instinct and muscle memory. The notes cascaded from the piano like water over a cliff, powerful, relentless, overwhelming. And somehow impossibly his hands kept up. They remembered the patterns, remembered the fingerings, remembered which muscles to tense and which to keep loose. The arthritis he'd worried about didn't matter. The decades away from the instrument didn't matter. In this moment, Isaiah was 22 again. He was 16 again. He was every age he'd ever been when music was the center of his universe. The crowd was no longer just listening. They were experiencing something, collectively witnessing what felt like a miracle. A man who shouldn't be able to play, who had every reason not to be able to play, was performing one of the most demanding pieces in the piano repertoire with the skill of a concert artist. Julian Cross had stopped checking the program. He was simply listening now, his eyes closed, letting the music wash over him. A smile played at the corner of his mouth. He knew what he was hearing. He recognized greatness when he encountered it. The presto section built to a fever pitch before suddenly cutting off, dropping into a quiet, introspective passage. This was Chopin's genius, the way he could shift from chaos to calm in a single measure, the way he understood that the most powerful moments in music are often the quietest ones. Isaiah's hands slowed. The melody became fragmented, searching questioning again. This was the emotional core of the ballad. The place where all the themes and motifs came together, where the listener was supposed to feel the weight of everything that had come before. He thought of his father dying too young. He thought of his mother's guilt and grief. He thought of Claire, who'd loved him through everything. He thought of Professor Volkov and the promise he'd made. He thought of 30 years of emptying trash cans while music played in rooms he wasn't meant to enter, and he channeled all of it into these quiet measures. Every loss, every regret, every moment of longing for something that had been taken away. The tears came without warning. He felt them running down his face, but couldn't stop to wipe them away. His hands kept playing, kept telling the story, kept honoring the music and the life it represented. In the audience, people were crying too. They didn't know Isaiah's story, not the details. But music has a way of communicating truths that words can't touch. They heard his life in these notes. They felt his pain and his perseverance. They understood even without understanding that they were witnessing something profound. The quiet section resolved, and the final phase of the ballad began. This was it. The culmination, the place where everything had been building toward. The tempo increased again. The dynamics swelled. Chopin was bringing all his themes back, weaving them together, driving toward a conclusion that would either feel inevitable or feel forced, depending on how well the pianist could execute it. Isaiah knew exactly where this music needed to go. He'd studied it for months at Berklee, had analyzed every measure, with Professor Volkov had played it in his dreams during the 30 years when real pianos were out of reach. His hands moved across the keyboard with absolute certainty now. All doubt was gone. All fear was burned away. There was only the music and the moment and the strange, beautiful gift of being allowed to do the thing you were meant to do. The final section of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 would take the next 6 minutes. 6 minutes to complete the journey. 6 minutes to prove that a gift once given never really dies. It only waits for the moment when it's needed most. The final movement of the ballade is a tour de force. It takes every theme that's been introduced, the questioning melody, the pastoral section, the fiery presto, and synthesizes them into something greater than their parts. It's Chopin saying, "Here is what heartbreak sounds like. Here is what hope sounds like. Here is what it means to lose everything and find the strength to continue anyway." Isaiah's hands had found their rhythm now. The shakiness from the beginning was long gone. He was no longer a 52-year-old janitor trying to remember how to play. He was a musician doing what musicians do, channeling something larger than himself through vibrating strings and resonating wood. The technical passages were demanding. There were moments that required his hands to stretch painful intervals, fingers that needed to move independently in complex rhythms, runs that covered 3 octaves in the space of a single beat. He could feel his hands tiring. 30 years was 30 years, and no amount of muscle memory could completely compensate for muscles that hadn't done this work in decades. But pain didn't matter. Fatigue didn't matter. What mattered was serving the music, honoring Chopin's intent, completing the journey that had started with a single note 10 minutes ago. The Steinway Grand was responding beautifully. The instrument was a masterpiece itself, capable of subtle gradations of tone that cheaper pianos couldn't produce. When Isaiah played softly, the sound was intimate, like a whispered secret. When he played forte, the sound filled the entire hall without ever becoming harsh or brittle. The Davidson Concert Hall's acoustics did the rest. The sound bounced off the carefully designed surfaces, creating a rich, full resonance that made the single piano sound like an entire orchestra. Every person in the audience was hearing the music exactly as Chopin had intended it to be heard, with perfect clarity, perfect balance, perfect truth. Julian Cross had opened his eyes again and was watching Isaiah's hands, with the focus of a master craftsman observing a fellow artisan. He could see the technique, the way Isaiah's wrists stayed loose, the way his fingers curved at exactly the right angle, the way his whole body moved with the music rather than fighting against it. This wasn't amateur playing. This was professional-level performance. Where had this man come from? How had someone with this much talent ended up pushing a cleaning cart? Cross made a mental note to speak with Isaiah after the performance to get his story to understand how such a gift could have been hidden for so long. The music built toward one of the ballade's many climaxes. Chopin had structured the piece like a series of waves, each one larger than the last, building to a final tsunami that would either devastate or redeem. This was one of the intermediate peaks, powerful, but not yet the ultimate moment. Isaiah's hands executed a series of rapid chords in both hands, driving upward, building tension. The dynamic marking was fortissimo, as loud as possible, but the key was to maintain control even at maximum volume. The sound needed to be powerful, but never crude. The Steinway responded with glorious volume. The notes rang out like bells, filling every corner of the hall. Several people in the audience actually gasped at the sound. It was overwhelming in the best possible way, the kind of musical moment that reminds you why concert halls exist, why live performance matters, why recorded music can never quite capture the visceral impact of sound produced in real time in shared space. The climax peaked and then fell away, dissolving into a quieter passage. This was the genius of Chopin, knowing that you couldn't sustain intensity forever, that the quiet moments gave meaning to the loud ones, that restraint was as important as power. Isaiah's hands slowed. The melody became tender, almost fragile. This section always reminded him of his mother, the way she'd touched his face when he was young, the way she'd believed in him with an absolute faith that he'd never quite believed he deserved. He played this section for her, for the woman who'd cleaned houses so her son could make music instead, for the mother who'd apologized for a sacrifice that had actually been a gift, even if the gift had taken 30 years to unwrap. The audience was completely still. You could have heard a pin drop, 600 people breathing as one, following the story Isaiah was telling through his hands, through Chopin's notes, through the language of sound that needs no translation. Helena Briggs was openly crying now, not even trying to hide it. This evening had been saved, no, not saved, transformed. This was better than Vladimir Petrov would have been, precisely because it was impossible, because it was real, because it was a man rediscovering himself in real time and letting everyone witness it. Even Garrett Ashford stood motionless, his earlier certainty completely eroded. He'd been wrong. Publicly, dramatically, obviously wrong. The janitor he'd humiliated, the man he'd dismissed as incompetent and worthless, was performing music that Ashford couldn't have produced in 1,000 years of trying. The question now was whether Ashford was capable of recognizing that he'd been wrong, whether his ego could survive the revelation that job titles and bank accounts and social status meant nothing in the face of genuine talent and truth. The ballade continued its journey. Isaiah had been playing for 12 minutes now, 12 minutes without pause, without mistake, without faltering. His hands were aching. His back was sore from sitting in an unfamiliar position. His eyes were stinging from the tears that kept flowing. but he'd never felt more alive. This was why he'd been born. This was what his parents had recognized and nurtured. This was the promise he'd made to Professor Volkov. This was the gift that had waited patiently for 30 years to be used again. The music shifted again, moving into the final build toward the true climax. The tempo increased. The dynamics swelled. All the themes were coming back, now woven together in counterpoint, creating a tapestry of sound that was almost overwhelming in its complexity. Isaiah's hands moved faster, executing passages that required absolute precision and perfect timing. There was no room for error here. A single wrong note, a single fumbled rhythm, and the entire structure would collapse. But his hands knew the way. They'd always known the way. They'd just been waiting for permission to show it. The final approach to the climax was like climbing a mountain, each phrase taking you higher, the air getting thinner, the view more spectacular. Isaiah could feel the end coming, could sense the place where Chopin had designed the ultimate release of tension. Just a little farther, just a little more. The audience leaned forward collectively, unconsciously, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. And then Isaiah's hands reached the passage that would take them to the peak. The final climax of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 is one of the most devastating moments in all of piano literature. Everything that's come before, all the themes, all the emotions, all the technical demands comes together in a passage of such intensity and beauty that it can leave listeners shaken. Isaiah approached it with his hands moving faster than conscious thought. The patterns were pure muscle memory, now executed at a level that bypassed his brain entirely. This was the gift Professor Volkov had spoken of, the ability to let the music flow through you rather than from you. The passage required both hands to play rapid octaves while maintaining a clear melodic line. It was technically brutal, demanding strength and stamina and absolute precision. Many professional pianists fumbled here, let the difficulty overwhelm the musicality. But Isaiah's hands remembered. More than that, they understood. Each octave rang out clear and true, building in intensity, driving upward like a wave, gathering strength before it crashes on the shore. The dynamic marking was fortissimo, then fortissimo, as loud as humanly possible. But loud didn't mean crude. The sound had to maintain its beauty even at maximum volume. The Steinway had to sing, not shout. Isaiah's whole body was engaged now. His back arched slightly. His shoulders carried the weight of each chord. His arms moved with purpose and power. This wasn't just finger work. This was full-body commitment to the sound he was creating. The Steinway responded magnificently. The sound was massive, overwhelming, filling the entire Davidson Concert Hall with a wall of music that was almost physical in its impact. People in the audience felt it in their chests, in their bones, in the spaces behind their eyes where tears were forming. This was why they'd come tonight. This was what they'd paid for. Not just notes played correctly, but music that reached inside and rearranged something fundamental about how you understood the world. Julian Cross had tears streaming down his face. He'd heard this ballad performed hundreds of times by some of the greatest pianists alive. He'd conducted orchestras accompanying soloists who'd devoted their entire lives to mastering this piece. But he'd never heard it played with more genuine emotion, more raw truth, than what Isaiah Bennett was producing right now. The climax built higher. Chopin had written a series of ascending arpeggios that covered the entire keyboard, rising from the lowest register to the highest, each one louder than the last, creating a sense of ascension that felt almost spiritual. Isaiah's hands flew across the keys. His fingers were on fire now, burning with the effort, but he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. This was the moment everything had been building toward. This was the reason he'd walked away from his cleaning cart. This was the vindication of every choice, every sacrifice, every year of silence. The ascending arpeggios reached the top of the keyboard. The highest notes rang out crystal clear, soaring above everything else, like light breaking through darkness. And then the moment Chopin had built an entire 10-minute piece to prepare for the release. A series of crashing chords descending now instead of ascending, powerful beyond measure, but somehow also tender, somehow also wounded. This was heartbreak and triumph combined. This was loss acknowledged and transcended. This was every human emotion concentrated into 4 measures of music. Isaiah played those chords with everything he had. Every ounce of strength, every molecule of feeling, every memory of his father, his mother, his wife, his younger self. Every year of regret and longing. Every moment of invisibility and silence. The sound was cataclysmic. It filled the hall, filled the air, filled the space between heartbeats. It was too much and exactly right all at once. And then, after that devastating climax, Chopin did something unexpected. He didn't end the piece. Instead, he dropped immediately into a quiet coda, a final reflection on everything that had come before. Isaiah's hands slowed. The volume dropped from fortissimo to pianissimo in a single measure. The sound went from overwhelming to intimate, from public declaration to private whisper. This final section lasted only about 90 seconds, but it was crucial. It was the moment of integration where all the chaos and passion had to resolve into something approaching peace. Not happiness. Chopin was too sophisticated for that. But acceptance, perhaps. Understanding. The bitter wisdom that comes from surviving loss. Isaiah played it with infinite tenderness. His hands were exhausted. His entire body was shaking, but he kept going. The music demanded it. The story needed its ending. The final measures consisted of a simple melody in the right hand harmonized by gentle chords in the left. It descended gradually like someone walking downstairs in the dark, uncertain but determined. The very last phrase was marked morendo, dying away. The sound had to fade to almost nothing, the final notes barely audible, as if the music itself was falling asleep or slipping away into memory. Isaiah played those final notes with tears streaming openly down his face. His hands trembled. The last chord, a G minor triad, simple and devastating, rang out softly into the silence. He held it, let the sound decay, naturally didn't use the sustain pedal to artificially extend it. Just the pure, natural resonance of the Steinway's strings vibrating in the Davidson's perfect acoustic space. The sound faded more, became a whisper, became a memory, became silence. Isaiah's hands lifted from the keys. The piece was finished. Chopin's Ballade, number 1 in G minor, all 14 minutes of it performed by a 52-year-old janitor who hadn't touched a piano in 30 years. The silence held. No one moved. No one breathed. The moment stretched suspended between the end of the music and whatever came next. Isaiah sat at the piano, His head bowed, his hands resting in his lap, utterly spent. He'd given everything. There was nothing left. And then someone started clapping. The first person to applaud was Julian Cross. The conductor stood up, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate claps that echoed in the silent hall. It wasn't the polite applause that audiences give when they feel they should. It was the applause of recognition of one musician acknowledging another. Then someone else joined in. Then another. Then suddenly the entire audience was on their feet, and the sound was deafening. It wasn't just applause. It was an ovation, a standing ovation for a man most of them hadn't known existed 15 minutes ago. 600 wealthy, sophisticated Bostonians who'd come to hear a world-famous pianist were applauding a janitor with more enthusiasm than they'd ever shown for any professional performer. The sound crashed over Isaiah like a wave. He looked up, startled, disoriented. For a moment, he couldn't process what was happening. His brain still lost in Chopin, and memory struggled to return to the present moment. They were standing, all of them, clapping for him. Helena Briggs was applauding with her hands over her head, tears still streaming down her face. The servers along the walls had abandoned any pretense of professionalism and were clapping too, some of them shouting. The string quartet that had played earlier was standing with their instruments still in hand, joining the ovation. Julian Cross walked toward the stage, still applauding. He climbed the steps and approached Isaiah, who was still sitting at the piano bench, looking dazed. "Stand up," Cross said, his voice gentle. "Stand up and take your bow." Isaiah stood on shaky legs. The applause somehow got louder. Someone whistled. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" The sound was overwhelming, disorienting, nothing like anything Isaiah had ever experienced. Cross extended his hand. Isaiah shook it, and the conductor pulled him into a brief embrace. "That was extraordinary," Cross said directly into Isaiah's ear, so he could be heard over the applause. "Truly extraordinary. We need to talk. After this, we need to talk." Isaiah nodded, still unable to form words. His throat was tight with emotion. His vision was blurred with tears. His entire body was shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, and something that might have been joy, or might have been shock, or might have been both. The applause continued. It went on and on, building rather than fading. People were calling out, some crying, all of them caught up in the moment, in the sheer improbability of what they'd just witnessed. Near the back of the hall, Isaiah saw his supervisor, Martha, the facilities manager, who'd hired him 15 years ago, who'd always been kind, but never particularly close. She was clapping with her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. She'd worked alongside him for 15 years and never known, never suspected. He'd been that good at being invisible. The applause was finally beginning to fade when Garrett Ashford moved. He'd been standing frozen in place, his hands at his sides, not clapping. Now he pushed through the crowd toward the stage. The room went quiet again, sensing drama. Everyone remembered what Ashford had said earlier, how he'd humiliated Isaiah, how he'd mocked the very idea that a janitor could play. Ashford climbed the stage steps. His face was unreadable. Not angry exactly, but not apologetic either. Something complicated was happening behind his eyes, some internal struggle between ego and reality. He stopped in front of Isaiah. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other. The entire audience waited to see what would happen next. Garrett Ashford extended his hand. It was a stiff gesture. Uncomfortable, the bare minimum acknowledgement that something had occurred that required response. Isaiah looked at the offered hand, but didn't immediately take it. The humiliation from earlier was still fresh. The wine spilled, the public mockery, the casual cruelty of a man who'd never had to consider how his words might wound. That was impressive, Ashford said. The words seemed to cost him something. I clearly underestimated you. It wasn't an apology. It was an admission, but not an apology. There was no, "I'm sorry for the cruelty," no acknowledgement that he'd treated Isaiah as less than human, no recognition that job titles and social status had nothing to do with worth or talent or dignity. Isaiah finally spoke, his voice rough from emotion and exertion. "You didn't underestimate me, Mr. Ashford. You didn't estimate me at all. You looked at my uniform and decided you knew everything about who I was and what I was worth." He paused. "You were wrong." The audience was silent, watching this confrontation unfold. This was dangerous territory. Garrett Ashford was not a man accustomed to being contradicted, especially not publicly. Ashford's jaw tightened. "I judge people by what they present to the world. You presented yourself as a janitor." "I am a janitor," Isaiah said quietly. "That's my job. But it's not who I am. It's never been who I am." He looked directly into Ashford's eyes. "The mistake you made wasn't assuming janitors can't play piano. The mistake you made was assuming that a person's job defines their worth." Someone in the audience Isaiah couldn't see who started clapping. Others joined in. It was slower than the ovation for the music, more deliberate, more pointed. It was applause not for technical skill, but for moral courage. Ashford's hand was still extended, still waiting to be shaken. His face had flushed red, but whether from anger or shame was impossible to tell. "I don't need your approval," Isaiah continued. "I never did. I needed only to prove to myself that I hadn't lost who I used to be, that 30 years of circumstances hadn't erased the gift I was given." He looked out at the audience. "Music doesn't care about your bank account. It doesn't care about your job title or your social status. Music cares about truth. And tonight I told the truth." Julian Cross, still standing nearby, nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Yes, you did." Ashford's hand finally dropped. He hadn't been shaken, and Isaiah saw the moment when the man understood that he wouldn't be. That his money and power and social position meant nothing in this context, that he'd been weighed and found wanting. "I see," Ashford said stiffly. He turned to leave, then paused. What he said next surprised everyone, including perhaps himself. "I hope you find somewhere better to work than cleaning up after people like me." It wasn't an apology, but it was something, maybe a recognition, however uncomfortable, that Isaiah deserved more than the invisibility Ashford and others like him had imposed on him. Ashford walked off the stage. The audience parted for him, but the looks he received were no longer admiring. He'd been exposed not by Isaiah's words, but by Isaiah's talent, by the undeniable demonstration that worth and value exist independent of wealth and status. Helena Briggs stepped onto the stage, her professional composure mostly restored. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly now that the audience was quiet again. "I think we can all agree that this evening has been unexpected." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "Isaiah Bennett has given us something far more valuable than the scheduled performance. He's reminded us why music matters, why talent matters, why we should never make assumptions about what people are capable of." More applause. Isaiah stood there, still processing everything. Still half convinced this was a dream, and he'd wake up in his apartment with his alarm clock buzzing. Isaiah Helena continued, "I don't know your full story yet, but I'd very much like to learn it. And I suspect I'm not the only one." Julian Cross stepped forward again. "Indeed. Mr. Bennett, would you be willing to speak with me after the event concludes? I have some opportunities I'd like to discuss with you." Isaiah nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Opportunities. The word felt foreign, impossible. He'd spent 30 years without opportunities, without possibilities, without the sense that his life could be anything other than what it was. But now something had changed. The door he'd thought was permanently closed had swung open. The question was whether he had the courage to walk through it. The gala had effectively ended. The formal program was over, but nobody wanted to leave. Small clusters of people formed throughout the hall, everyone discussing what they'd just witnessed. Isaiah's name, which most of them had learned only minutes ago, was on everyone's lips. Isaiah had been guided to a quiet corner backstage by Helena Briggs. His hands were still shaking, and he'd accepted a bottle of water gratefully. His throat was parched, his body exhausted. He felt like he'd run a marathon. Julian Cross joined them, along with a woman Isaiah recognized as Cross's companion from earlier. She was introduced as Margaret Reynolds, a wealthy philanthropist and board member of the Boston Philharmonic. Mr. Bennett Cross began settling into a chair across from Isaiah. "I need to understand. Where have you been? How has someone with your talent been working as a janitor?" Isaiah told them. Not everything the full story would take hours, but enough. Berklee. His father's death. Withdrawing 3 weeks before graduation. 30 years of silence. The music that never left him even when the pianos did. Cross listened with increasing amazement and sadness. "You never went back. Never tried to resume your studies. I couldn't afford it. And honestly, I thought it was too late. I thought I'd missed my chance." Isaiah's voice was rough. "I thought the door was closed." "Doors are never closed," Margaret Reynolds said firmly. "Not if the talent is real. And your talent, Mr. Bennett, is extraordinary." Cross leaned forward. "I want to be very clear about something. What you did tonight performing the Chopin ballade after 30 years away from the piano, that's not normal. That's not something that happens. That level of muscle memory, that instinct, that emotional depth, that's the mark of someone with rare gifts." "Professor Volkoff said I had a gift," Isaiah said quietly. "But gifts don't pay bills. They don't take care of sick parents or dying spouses." "No," Cross agreed. "But they shouldn't be wasted either. And yours has been wasted long enough." He glanced at Margaret, some silent communication passing between them. "We'd like to offer you something. Several things, actually." Isaiah's heart was racing again. "What kind of things?" "First, a scholarship," Margaret said. "To complete your degree at Berklee. I'm on the board there as well as at the Philharmonic. We can arrange it." Isaiah's throat tightened. "I'm 52 years old." And Margaret smiled. "You have, 30 more years of life ahead of you, probably more. Are you going to spend them pushing a cleaning cart? Or are you going to spend them making music?" "Second," Cross continued, "I'd like to commission you to perform with the Boston Philharmonic. A proper concert professionally promoted. I'm thinking late spring, give you time to prepare a full program." Isaiah couldn't speak. His eyes burned with fresh tears. Third, Helena Briggs added, stepping into the conversation, "I'd like to offer you a position here at the Davidson. Not as facilities staff, as artist in residence. We have a program for emerging talent, though admittedly, you're emerging from an unusual direction." "I don't understand," Isaiah managed. "An hour ago, I was emptying your trash cans. Now you're offering me everything you should have had 30 years ago," Cross said simply. "Better late than never." "Mr. Bennett, but I haven't played in 30 years. What if tonight was a fluke? What if I can't do it again?" Cross smiled. "That wasn't a fluke. That was years of training and natural talent combining in a moment of necessity. Could you be rusty on some pieces? Of course. Will you need to rebuild stamina and work on technique? Absolutely. But the foundation is there. The gift is there. Everything else is just work. and I suspect you're not afraid of work." Isaiah thought of his father working double shifts, his mother cleaning houses, Claire fighting cancer with dignity. No, he wasn't afraid of work. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't know me." "I know your music," Cross said. "That's enough. Great talent deserves opportunity. It's that simple." Margaret Reynolds pulled out a business card. "Think about it. Though honestly, if you say no, I'm going to be very disappointed and possibly quite persistent." Isaiah took the card with trembling hands. Margaret Reynolds, it read. Executive Director, Reynolds Foundation for the Arts. A phone number, an email address, a door opening. "There's one condition," Cross said, his tone serious now. Isaiah's heart sank. "Here it comes," he thought. "The catch. You have to promise me something. The same promise you made to your teacher all those years ago. Don't waste the gift. Not anymore. Whatever you decide to do, whether you take our offers or not, you have to keep playing. You owe that to yourself. You owe it to your father and mother and wife. You owe it to everyone who sacrificed so you could have this talent." Isaiah remembered Professor Volkov, his hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "You promise me this?" "I promise," Isaiah said, and this time he understood what the promise meant. It meant honoring the gift even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. "Good." Cross extended his hand properly this time. "Welcome back to the world of music, Mr. Bennett. You've been gone too long." They shook hands, and Isaiah felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't healing. You don't heal 30 years of loss in a single night. But it was the beginning of healing. It was permission to be who he'd always been meant to be. Spring in New York City. Carnegie Hall's stern auditorium gleamed under the lights, its legendary acoustics ready to carry sound to the ears of 2,800 audience members. Isaiah Bennett stood backstage wearing a tuxedo that Margaret Reynolds had insisted on buying him. It fit properly, professionally tailored, nothing like the rental he'd worn to his high school prom 40-plus years ago. He wasn't nervous. That surprised him. He'd expected to be terrified standing here about to walk onto one of the most famous stages in the world. But instead he felt calm. Ready. This was where he was supposed to be. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind. He'd started back at Berklee as the oldest student in his program, had endured some strange looks, but more often received respect and encouragement. He'd practiced 6 hours a day, rebuilding technique, learning new repertoire, remembering old pieces. His hands had ached. His back had protested. But he'd kept at it, kept working, kept honoring the promise. He'd performed at the Davidson Concert Hall monthly as their artist-in-residence, building a following, getting comfortable performing again. The audiences had been generous, supportive, curious about the janitor who could play piano. The media had picked up the story. From janitor to concert pianist, the headlines read. He'd done interviews, though he tried to keep them brief. The story wasn't really about him. It was about talent and opportunity, and the doors that close and sometimes rarely miraculously open again. He'd established a scholarship fund in his father's name, the Marcus Bennett Music Scholarship for talented students who needed financial support. Margaret Reynolds had contributed the seed money. Others had joined. It would help kids like he'd been kids with gifts and dreams and obstacles. And tonight he would perform Chopin's Ballade No. 1 at Carnegie Hall, with Julian Cross conducting the Boston Philharmonic in support. The same piece he'd played that December night at the Davidson. The piece that had changed everything. A stage manager appeared. 5 minutes, Mr. Bennett. Isaiah nodded. He walked to the curtain, looked out at the filling auditorium. He could see Margaret Reynolds in the front row. Helena Briggs was there too. Martha, his former facilities supervisor, had a seat wearing her finest dress and crying already, even though he hadn't played a note. In the back row, he'd made sure they had tickets, were 3 of his former colleagues from the Davidsons' maintenance staff. They'd applauded the loudest when he'd told them about tonight. The seat next to Margaret was empty. It would remain empty. That was for Claire, for his parents, for Professor Volkov, for everyone who'd believed in him and hadn't lived to see this moment. Julian Cross appeared at his side. "Ready, ready," Isaiah confirmed. "Remember," Cross said quietly, "once you start playing, all of this disappears. The audience, the pressure, the story. It's just you and the music. That's all it ever is." Isaiah smiled. "I remember." The lights dimmed. The audience quieted. Julian Cross walked onto the stage to applause, took his position at the conductor's podium. And Isaiah Bennett, 52 years old, former janitor, Berklee dropout, keeper of promises, walked onto the Carnegie Hall stage to begin the second act of his life. Isaiah played that night at Carnegie Hall like he'd played at the Davidson 6 months earlier, with everything he had, every ounce of feeling, every lesson learned from 30 years of loss and silence. The audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted 7 minutes. Critics called it a triumph of human spirit and a masterclass in emotional storytelling through music. One review simply said, "Isaiah Bennett plays like a man who knows what it means to lose everything and finds beauty in the surviving." But the performance itself wasn't the point. Not really. The point was that Isaiah Bennett had spent 30 years invisible, had spent 30 years believing that doors once closed stayed closed forever. He'd believed that gifts unused for too long would wither and die. He'd believed that some chances once missed could never come again. And he'd been wrong about all of it. The gift had waited. The door had opened. The chance had returned. Not because of magic or divine intervention or cosmic justice, but because he'd finally had the courage to try. Because he'd walked onto a stage when every rational instinct told him not to. Because he'd honored the promises he'd made even when he thought he'd broken them beyond repair. The truth is that most of us carry gifts we've forgotten about or buried under the weight of circumstances. We tell ourselves it's too late. We're too old, we've missed our chance, the door is closed. We make peace with being less than we could be because making peace is easier than fighting for something that feels impossible. But sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes the universe conspires to remind you that it's not too late, that doors can reopen, that gifts don't die, they just wait. Isaiah Bennett went on to play at concert halls across America. He completed his degree at Berklee, graduated with honors, became the oldest graduate in the program's history. He taught master classes, mentored young musicians, used his story to inspire others who thought their chances had passed them by. But he never forgot where he came from. He still visited the Davidson Concert Hall regularly, still knew every janitor by name, still treated the facilities staff with the respect and dignity they deserved. And on the anniversary of that December night when everything changed, he always played at the Davidson for free, a thank you performance for the place that had kept him close to music, even when he couldn't play it, even when he thought he'd never play again. Because the real lesson of Isaiah Bennett's story isn't about music. It's about this: you are not your job. You are not your circumstances. You are not the sum of your losses or the weight of your obligations. You are the gifts you've been given, even when those gifts lie dormant for years, even when you've forgotten they exist. And it's never too late. It's never ever too late to reclaim what's yours to honor, what you've been given to step out of the shadows and into the light and say, this is who I am. This is what I can do. This is the gift I carry. The janitor who played Chopin at a charity gala taught Boston's elite a lesson they wouldn't forget. Talent doesn't care about your status. Worth isn't measured by your paycheck. And humanity exists in everyone, even those you've trained yourself not to see. Isaiah Bennett played piano at Carnegie Hall. But more importantly, he remembered who he was. He reclaimed his gift. He honored his promises. And in doing so, he reminded us all that we can do the same. The question is, will we? Will we find the courage to try? Will we walk out of our shadows and into our light? Or will we stay invisible forever, letting our gifts die unused, our promises unfulfilled, our potential locked away in service corridors and behind closed doors? Isaiah chose to play. What will you choose?